Hi, this is Uri L'Tzedek's Talking Torah and Tzedek. I'm Judry Subar, and I'm here with Nigel Savage, who's the founder and CEO of Hazon, which is known as the Jewish Lab for Sustainability. So Nigel, what's that mean, the Jewish Lab for Sustainability?
So, first of all, just before I say that, Jude, I just want to say it is great to see you. It is great to be able to do this, as it were, with and for Uri L'Tzedek. And I simply want to say that across the whole landscape of Jewish life, Uri L'Tzedek punches way above its weight. And although Hazon as an organization plays across a wide ideological range, those people who on the one hand are Jewishly serious and grounded in halakha, grounded in tradition on the one hand, and actively engaged in making a better world for everybody on the other hand, those are the people that I'm most inspired by. And I want to say truthfully that I've watched and followed and occasionally partnered with Uri L'Tzedek almost since it began. And it's why I'm particularly genuinely honored to be with you today. So yes, Hazon. So the word is not the Hebrew for sweaty spandex, which some people once thought. The word is Hebrew for vision. We tag ourselves as the Jewish Lab for Sustainability. But we're in a moment, as well as everything else that is happening, we're in a moment of climate crisis. It is the greatest issue facing humankind over the remainder of our lifetimes. And Hazon's task is to engage the Jewish community and to turn the Jewish community outwards to work to make a more sustainable world for everybody. And there is no single way of doing that, but that ultimately is what we're about.
Okay. So I'd like to talk cycling just for a second. You made a reference to it when you referred to spandex. From its beginning, I know that Hazon has had a relationship with cycling. As a matter of fact, I think you or someone in the organization came up with the term, the people of the bike. I'm just wondering, is that just a catchy but effective marketing jingle, or is there something deeper going on there?
No, I don't think it's deep, but I think we came up with it 20 years ago. We began Hazon with a Cross USA Jewish environmental bike ride, and I led a group of people in cycling from Seattle, Washington to Washington, D.C. to raise environmental awareness. And we stopped along the way in churches and synagogues. We did press and TV. We ended at the White House. We won an award at the EPA. And we had this line because we have always been the people of the book. And you can, it's not deliberate, but you can see behind me a typically Jewish load of books. It's not that I don't love books, but in saying the people of the book is now the people of the bike, it's not very deep, but it was saying something about physically being out there in the world. And a bike is not a big deal, but as a society, we drive too far. Something like 30% of all car journeys in the United States are 3 miles or less. And as well as everything else, to ride across America is a way of saying, gosh, if we can ride this far, surely sometimes at least we can ride down to the grocery store.
Well, I, for one, am glad that you've raised the awareness of cycling in the Jewish community. So thank you for that. You've talked some about Hazon's focus on environmentalism. I know that's not that's not the exclusive focus of the organization, but I do know that what some people think about when they think about environmentalism is the relationship between humans and the non-human physical world. And when people think about social justice as a concept, I think a lot of people tend to relate that to the way people interact with each other. Do you think that's a helpful dichotomy, or is there something mistaken about that?
I think that many of us, gone through a useful learning curve in the last 5, 10, 15 years. I think that there was a period, and I think this is close to over, but I think there was a period when people thought of environmentalists as quote unquote save the whale or save the polar bear. And Greenpeace was sending out things that had polar bears on it. And truthfully, this is a period of great extinctions, and we're losing animal species at an alarming rate. And that's just one aspect of something that's going wrong in the world, and it's important. But I think that as much as we care about animals and as much as we care about trees, we care about human beings. And ultimately, the climate crisis is a human crisis. At one level, just in this most recent period, the reason that we've seen a higher proportion of deaths and hospital stays from people who are African American and from people who are minorities and from people who are low income is because those are the communities, amongst other things, which disproportionately have pollution and have poorer health support and have higher asthma rates. And all three of those things have made people in those categories more susceptible to COVID. If you look at it in a different way, the Syrian civil war triggered ultimately 5 million refugees, people who've lost their home. Those people right now are spread out across Jordan, the Middle East, and Europe. And they partly triggered, at least indirectly, a populist backlash in Europe. And yet the Syrian civil war itself partially traces back to drought in Syria, repeated years of drought, which is ultimately because we're heating up the planet. And as much as COVID has been a huge challenge, and we've at this point had whatever the number is, 200,000 or 300,000 people who've lost their lives around the world, which is a tragedy, in our lifetime, we could so superheat the planet that we end up with 100 million or 200 million refugees from the Indian subcontinent. That will be human pain and suffering on a scale only paralleled by the number of deaths in the First and Second World War in the 20th century. And so, yes, both as somebody who's alive on planet Earth as a human being, and as somebody who believes deeply in Jewish tradition, I believe that there is literally no task more important right now than engaging Jewish communities across the remainder of our lives to do all that we can to make a difference on these issues.
So it sounds like one of the things that you're saying is that there are relationships that are important for us as Jews to engage with and try to rectify. There are issues that on one level seem separate, like the issue of the pandemic, the issue of racial justice, the issue of environmental challenges. But really, it would be a mistake to silo them. Is that one of the things that you're saying?
Yeah, I think that one can disaggregate them. Not everything has to be smushed together. But I think it's a tragedy. And so we have to address it. Let me add one other thing in a different voice. The climate crisis is a terrible crisis for two reasons. Firstly, in general, we want to be able to imagine success. So in relationship to apartheid South Africa, people said, there should be a free democratic South Africa. Wouldn't it be amazing if Nelson Mandela were president? And it took 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 years and many hundreds of thousands of people. But in due course, even if imperfectly, there was a free democratic South Africa and Nelson Mandela was president. And the same was true in terms of getting the refuseniks out of the Soviet Union or defending Israel at the time of the Six-Day War, the Yom Kippur War, all sorts of things. But on the climate crisis, there is no likelihood in our lifetime of seeing a headline in the New York Times, great news, climate change fixed, go back to how you were. That's a huge psychological problem for us as human beings. We're not good at dealing with things that big and that vague and that amorphous. That's the first thing. The second thing is we want to claim the moral high ground. So on apartheid, we could say they're racist and I'm not racist. Or on the Soviet Union, they are oppressing people. I am not oppressing people. But on the climate crisis, we can talk about the oil companies or we can talk about this administration, but fundamentally, we've all grown up in ways that are literally unsustainable. I haven't owned a car since 1994, and we have clean power in our apartment. But just to be clear, I ride my bike to work, but I also get in taxis, and I also get on airplanes, and I also use rental cars. And so the fact that we can't define or imagine success, and the fact that we feel morally confused ourselves, I think it is incredibly important, and I say this to everybody at Uri L'Tzedek, to anybody watching or listening to this, to anybody involved in a shul or social action committee, it's okay to begin by acknowledging with this. Jewish tradition doesn't believe that we are perfect. It has processes of tshuva. Those processes never end. L'taken olam b'malchut Shaddai, to renew the world as the divine realm. That's a messianic goal. And so I think it's okay to just acknowledge how hard this issue is, notice it, and then we have to move forward and do stuff.
Okay. You've just referred to how Jewish tradition ties into the work that you do. I know that Hazon has used, in particular, the various Jewish agricultural laws like Shemitah and so forth as platforms on which to develop some of its work and to challenge the rest of the Jewish world to follow its lead and try to fix some of the issues that you've been talking about. Could you comment on that a little bit? The use of Shemitah and so forth as concept?
Yes. So once every 7 years, Shemitah, it's the sabbatical year. Mostly outside of the United States, it's ignored. Orthodox shuls often have 1 or 2 shiurim on the topic. In Israel, every 7 years, there's an argument about what vegetables you can eat. And the modern Orthodox community, by and large, holds by a thing called the Hata Mechira, which is like a supersized version of selling your chametz. You sell the lamb to a non-Jew. And the Haredi community, the ultra-Orthodox community, doesn't hold by the Hata Mechira. So there's always an argument about who can eat what. Fine. When you unpack Shemitah, both in the Torah and in all of the commentaries since then, what is Shemitah about? It's about our relationship to land. It's about our relationship to equality, right? Because anybody during the Shemitah year can come and help themselves to produce. It's about debt and inequality, because there's Shemitah Kasafim, the annulment of debts in the Shemitah year. All of the things that Shemitah is about, and also cycles of overwork and rest. So overwork and rest, land, food, debt, inequality, definitions of community, what's mine, what's yours. All of those things, wow. When you start to look at them and you start to learn those texts and ask those questions, it's a heck of a lot more than the Hata Mechira. And what we've wanted to do as an organization is we've wanted to encourage communities. And again, truthfully, we're happy to say this whether you're observant or not, or frankly, whether you're Jewish or not, start to learn and unpack these texts. But certainly people who are in Orthodox communities, as we're taping this right now, we're a bit less than 18 months away from the next Shnat Shemitah, which is going to start at Rosh Hashanah in 2021. And we would simply say, use this period to have a conversation in your community, ask your rabbi to learn, get some people together and learn, and start to unpack these texts. We have source materials. And start a conversation about, what does this mean? How do we understand what it means to be Jewish based on the values of Shemitah? How do we as a community want to register the Shemitah year in different ways? And then the final kicker is that I strongly believe that we should be using from now till September of 21 to plan for the Shemitah year. Then from September of 21 to the day before Rosh Hashanah in September of 22, I think in some respects that Shemitah year should be different in Jewish communities. And this is not necessarily a halachic issue, but we could say, you know what, we're going to give all of our staff 1 day off a week during the Shemitah year, or during the Shemitah year to the extent that we can. Anybody in this community who can't afford it, fees are going to be free or reduced, whatever it may be. But the final kicker is the Shemitah year, in my view, should be used to discuss a 7-year plan for the community. Jewish institutions run on Jewish time. Shabbat is different than Tuesday. Hanukkah is different than Pesach. Pesach is different than Yom Kippur. How can we not observe the 7 years of Shemitah as a distinct period of time? There are now more than 70 institutions that have joined the Hazon Seal of Sustainability. At least one of them, I think 1 or 2 of them are led by Uri L'Tzedek rabbis. But we would say to anybody watching this or listening to it, anybody involved in Uri L'Tzedek, your shul or your school should consider joining the Hazon Seal of Sustainability and use the period from now until September of 22 to start to flesh out what would it mean for us as an institution, slowly but surely, in the 7 years from 2022 to 2029, the next 7-year cycle in Jewish life, to make sustainability absolutely central to this institution. It's not an overnight decision. It's not an overnight question. How do we change the power that we use? How do we change HVAC? How do we integrate this in what we're teaching our kids? Do we grow any of our food? Do we compost our food? Do we have a food policy? Do we have soda bottles? Why or why not? Do we serve meat? Why or why not? What about the interfaith piece? What about the farm bill? There are so many questions here that are big questions. And if we try to do them all at once, they're overwhelming. But if we use the frame of Shemitah and say, okay, as a community over the next 7 years, a year at a time, we are going to raise our game, then in due course, we will change ourselves, we will change our institutions, we will change the Jewish community, and we will change the world.
That sounds like a big but important ask, a wonderful challenge that you've given to so many parts of the Jewish community, the community as a whole, and indeed the world as a whole. I'd like to ask you, as we're winding down, I don't want to put you on the spot too much, but I'd like to ask you if you can fashion a Dvar Torah in light of the following thought. And this has to do with the challenge that actually, according to the beginning of Sefer Bereshit, the beginning of the Torah, God gave to humanity. So God creates the world, he creates people, he says, be fruitful and multiply, and then God says, v'chiv shuha, meaning go out and, the way it's usually translated, and conquer the world. What does that mean in your view in Hazon terms?
So first of all, the Torah really matters. That line was significant. When James Watt was Reagan's Secretary of the Interior, and an environmentalist posed a particular question to the Old Testament and said, God gave us this land to conquer 2 creation stories, in Bereshit 1 and in Bereshit 2. And that appears in the second one, but in the first one we have Shamor v'Zachor, right? We are protecting, we're here to protect the land. And a traditional Jewish understanding has never said that this is ours to do with what we want, right? The Jewish understanding is that this is a partnership, this is God's earth. It's why we say a bracha before we eat. There is some understanding that this is ours, that we didn't create it. And so I think that all of Jewish tradition, particularly the brachot, for example, come to teach us what the Buddhists consider mindfulness, right? So that we pause for even a millisecond before we eat and think, what is this? Where did it come from? Who grew it? Who worked the land? How were they treated? Who transported it? Who picked it? Who unpacked it? Who cooked it? Right? And the same for animals and the same for fish. And so Jewish tradition, I think, wants to understand us as being in relationship to the land, in partnership with the land. And ultimately, our task is to leave the world in a better place than we find it. I think Jewish tradition has understood that for 20 centuries, but it has never been more important than it is today.
Okay, thanks. Could you just finish up by telling us about any plans Hazon has to undertake any new initiatives or anything like that going forward?
Yes, thank you for asking that. Firstly, go to hazon.org, Hazon, for information, and you can click there and give us your email. We will not inundate you, but you'll find out stuff that's going on there. We've just launched a new Jewish youth climate movement. If there are teenagers in your family who care about these issues, put them in touch with us. We would invite them to be involved in that. For the first time ever, we are doing a virtual Adama fellowship, our farming fellowship, which traditionally was a 3-month program, and it was only for 18 to 30-year-olds. Now we're doing it for 3 weeks, and you can do it if you're 18 or you're 98. And finally, in relationship to the rides, we started with a bike ride. And then in 2001, we started a New York ride. We started a 2003 Israel ride. This year, for the first time, starting July 4th weekend, we are going to do the summer of the 2020 vision rides. And we are going to invite people all over the country, wherever you are, to commit ultimately to ride 360,000 miles. And ride can also mean hike, it can mean run, it can mean walk, it can mean swim. Partly we want you to commit to make some further change in your own behavior. And partly we want you to commit to raise money not only for Hazon, but also for other institutions that are doing. You can sign up as a team for the 2020 Vision Rides, commit to making changes, and half the money that you raise will go to us, and half the money that you raise will in fact go to your institution for greening projects and to kickstart the Hazon Seal of Sustainability in your community. So it's a fourth weekend, but if you're seeing us before then, you can just email me at nigel@hazon.org. We would love to see you. And Jude and Amy, we hope that you make Maryland.
Thank you so much, Nigel. This has been great.